Hello friends, welcome to Sitecore User Group Delhi NCR. Today's session is all about the Sitecore events. Before starting this session, I would like to thank Pratik Satikunvar for agreeing and giving his time to share the knowledge with the community members. I would also like to thank all the participants for joining this session on weekend. Kindly make sure that your chat window is enabled and you can drop your queries over there and it will be answered at the end of the session. Pratik, you can start the session now. You can share the screen and go ahead.
Yep, so my screen is visible, right?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Nitish for organizing this event. It takes a lot of efforts by organizing such back-to-back events, and that is in such a great manner. So you are doing a great job, Nitish. Thanks for that. And I would also like to thank all the participants to attend this session in this hot summer. So before starting with this presentation, I would like to say why this topic, which is everything about Sitecore event, which is there from Sitecore 6.3 or 6.4. And while we have a lot of new features available in Sitecore 9, so why not that and why this topic? So in general, day-to-day development, what we used to do is we just start with component-based development and all those things. And normal most of the task we complete that by using that components and all those things. And for such few difficult tasks, we might go to the process pipelines and processors and all those things. So in that case, we generally miss out this section, which is Sitecore events, which is also a powerful section. And when we find some issues and we if we want to create some events or local events or remote events, at that time we find difficulties to understand that how it works and all those things. So that's why the motive was that to explain what everything about Sitecore events, because I also haven't got chance to look at deeply for around couple of years, starting couple of years. And when I got a requirement, I was able to implement that, but I was not 100% clear with the funda. So I will be sharing all about that. So I'll be starting with agenda. The first will be what is events in general, types of events in Sitecore available, an example of couple of events, common events inside core. Then we will be moving into design patterns little bit. That what is design pattern, different kind of design patterns available, and design pattern we will be talking about which Sitecore use for these events feature or event queue features that we'll be talking about in little bit detail. Then we'll be looking into a local event. What is local event? As there are two types of Sitecore events which we'll be looking into, then example of that and demo of local event. And at the end we'll have a remote event, which is quite a complex than a local event. We'll be looking into what is remote event and what is event queue, which will be in a correlation with remote event, then example demo and things to keep in mind with when you are creating a remote events. So that's the agenda for today's session. We'll be starting with simply what is events. So in general, programming event is an action based on the user interaction or something else. For example, you are clicking a something mouse button or pressing a key in a keyboard, and at the response you will get something from whichever user interface you are using. So that's what event is in a normal programming language. If you talk about the events in Sitecore has two types of event. One is local events and one is remote events. The local event, as we all know, that it is responsible for executing the stuff on your machine, while the remote event will be responsible for executing the stuffs on the remote machine in case if you have the multiple servers. So that's all. Brief introduction for local event and remote event. Some common events in Sitecore. So Sitecore have a lot of events there. If you see, if you have got chance to look at the show config, then you can find that lot of events are there, and each event has many multiple handlers. Some of them are item saved, item added, item delete, publish and remote. Look at the naming convention here, so that you can come to know that I'm talking about item and what action I performed, which is saved, and publish which action perform, that is and a remote which says that it is a remote event. So those are the common events in Sitecore. We generally don't look at that because Sitecore has already managed that. We just work on that and add presentation layers, saves that item got saved and everything. So we generally don't go into deep there, what is written there, what kind of handlers are there and all those things. So now we'll be talking about little bit about design patterns. So what is design pattern? So a design pattern are the solution to a general problems which arise in a software development in the development activity. So these design patterns are obtained by trial and error by a large group of software developers over a large period of time. And based on that, they have designed some patterns which we can use to overcome some general problems we might arise in our development activity. So that is a design pattern. One of the architect has started building the design patterns a while ago. Then gang of four, which is four software developers, were created a book which is on a design pattern, and then that got evaluation. So generally, there are three types of design patterns available, which is creational pattern, structural pattern, and behavior pattern, based on kind of active how we are dealing with the objects and all those things. Behavior of that, based on that, there are mainly three category. Most of the original patterns still exist, or I'm not sure how many are in use or how many are not in use, but still we can list all the patterns which are mentioned there in the starting of the design pattern books. Some are added and some are slightly improved based on the experience and as user uses those patterns. And most of the patterns are used as a base of nearly all applications. Sometimes we might not know that we have used this design pattern, but at the end we might have used some, at least any of the design pattern which is listed here. So these are the some of the non-design patterns. We'll be starting. There are many design patterns available, around 20 to 50, 25 design patterns available there. These are some common design patterns which I use a lot in my development activity, starting with the decorator pattern. So decorator pattern is that you add something on top of object without changing that object behavior. So if you have one object which is cake and want to add that cake with cheese, then you will be adding a decorator which is cheese, and you will be modifying that cake object. So that's kind of decorator object. Facade pattern is that you hide the actual implementation from the user, and user provide a user with an actions where user can call that action on a single class or interface. That's how you can achieve functionalities. And then there is an observer pattern where there are one object and couple of objects are dependent on that object. And once that parent object is changed or base object is changed, that child objects needs to be notified. That's called a observer pattern. And a factory and strategy pattern where there are some kind of common functionality, but a different entity is being used. For example, based on some type, which can be 8 to 10 types, you are performing some same operation or a different little bit of different operation. Then you can go for a factory or strategy pattern instead of using that if else and switch case. So these are some common design patterns which we can use to enhance our development style. And which design pattern we as Sitecore uses internally for this feature, and which we'll be talking about little bit in the detail, which is a publisher subscriber pattern, which is a sub part of observer pattern, where publisher publish message, and which your subscribe, they will receive those messages. So this pattern will be has been used for remote events, and we'll be talking about that. So it's not a good idea to talk this right now because we'll be understand that more along with the remote event. So I will be talking about this with along with the remote event. So how we can achieve this publisher subscriber pattern? So there are mainly two ways. One is events and delegates, and one is event aggregator. That will be looking into detail along with the remote event. So let's move into the actual area, which is two types of events which we've seen. One is local event, one is remote event. So what is local event? So events in Sitecore are similar to events in other system where there will be handlers of to that event. And when this event is called, those handlers will be executed and they will perform all the activities which you have been written there. So that's what event is. And in local event is that uh, it performs that event and let's get executed on a local event which has executed or triggered that action on that same machine. This activity will be triggered. So this is an example of event how it is got described in configuration in Sitecore, which is in Sitecore configuration events and event, where you can provide the name of event, which is item deleted, and you can specify the different handlers which will all get executed in a sequence, and that's how your event will get executed. So this is all about events which comes by default about inside course. Now what if I want to create a new event inside core, and how we can do that? So creating a custom event takes mainly majority a three part. One starts with the event arguments, the data, the class which you want to pass to the event, and you want to perform operation on that. That's the first step. Then the second step is defining an event, that you define event, and you define configuration for event, and you define multiple handlers for that event. So that's the second part. And the third part is that raising your event which you have just created. So we'll be seeing all these things in a practical manner. So let's move to the demo for the local events. So for this demo purpose, I have created these three instances. One is where I have created two CM and one CD. This is CM1, this is CM2, and this is CD. So I'll be using those for local events and remote event demo purpose. We'll be starting with local events. So as we see in the presentation, that will first step for the custom events will be to creating arguments. So we'll be creating this local event args where you can that needs to be inherited from event args, and I pass native event args, and you can specify whatever properties you required to for the execution in the event. You can specify here. So I have only specified one property here for the demo purpose. So creating a model or argument class is the first step for any event, be it a local or be it a remote event. So we have created this one, that item name will be passing and that I will be using in event and in handler. So this I have created a local event tags. So let me just close everything except this. Now we have the arguments, and we know what we will be passing to that event and that. Then the second step was to create an event, an event handler. So this is event handler, which will be we have created. So event handler is nothing but a simple class which you don't need to inherit from anything, which we have created just simple class which is local event handler, and it has a method which should return a void, and it should have these two arguments. So that is mandatory, and you need to follow that one. So creating a handler, you just require this, creating a class and a method. Method should return a void, and it should have a two parameters, which is a sender and arguments. So that you need to follow. And within this event, when that event will be executed and this handler will get executed, what happens that we have written here, that the arguments which we are passing, which we have just created these local event tags, which will get passed, and that we have converted to a local event tags. And what we are just doing is just we are just adding an entry into log file so that we can come to know that local event has been raised. This, so first of all, we created this event args, so arguments which we need to pass to event and handlers. Then we created this handler. You can create n number of handlers, and you can pass data between one handler to another handler. You can modify the data in handlers. You can directly change the value of these arguments here, so that will be carried out to the next handler. And once we have done these event arguments and handler, we need to define event local event configurations. So for that, what you need to do is you can create a batch file, and in a Sitecore events event, you can specify your event name. So I created this item local event, and I have specified this handler. I have created only one handler, so I have specified that, which is SE events, local event, and local event handler, and which method needs to be executed, which is on local event, which I have created here. So it's pretty simple that you create arguments, you create handlers, if you specify uh, events in the configurations here, and at the last part will be that to executing that event or raising that event. So for that, I have created one page which is a local event in my instance, and in local event, I have added one controller rendering. And in controller rendering, what I'm doing is I'm just creating a new instance of these arguments and passing this SUGNCR in item name, and I'm just raising this event using sitecode dot events dot event dot raise event, your event name which you have specified here, that should be exactly matching, and your arguments. And I've just written empty result. So let's see how it's working. So this is my CD environment, and if I look at event page, then this get executed, and our code should have got executed. So let's look at the CD environment and logs file where we have added that logs that should be present there. We have this one. So this means that our local event has got executed successfully. So this was just an example. So I have just added a log entry, but you can do whatever as per your business needs based on multiple handlers. So this is quite simple, as we see that number of steps you need to follow when starting with the arguments, then handlers, then configurations, and at the end raising the events. So that is all about local events, and that's pretty straightforward. And we'll be more talking about the remote events. So let's move back to the presentations. So what is about remote events and why actually we require a remote events? Like in our local environment, we used to have that CM and CD in a single instance, so we do not require anything. So everything we perform, like creating a changing item or anything that gets affected in our local machine. But while we go to the distributed environments, and one based on the action performed on one server that needs to be updated on a second server or a multiple server, we require a remote event. For example, if you are changing a content of item and you are publishing that item from CM, then your CD instant needs to know that I this item has been updated and I need to clear cache for this item. And if that doesn't understand that, it will keep showing the old contents which is not relevant. So that's where the remote events comes into the picture. So the remote events are responsible for executing events and run the event handlers on a remote machines based on the activities which is carried out on a local machine. So this is an example of remote event, which is quite same as the local event, except that we specify a different name which is called remote so that we can identify this is a remote event. Apart from that, everything is same as local event in a configuration part. And now comes to a picture which is event queue. So what is event queue and why we require event queue? But before moving to that, we will be talking about uh, design pattern which we talked, which is publish and subscribe pattern, which Sitecore uses. So this is an example of publisher subscriber pattern where you are publishing message A and message B, and subscriber one has already subscribed for message A, then that should be receiving message A, while two subscribers have subscribed for message B, they will be receiving message B. So this is example, normal example, real world example of receiving SMS. Now, how will be can how that can be this design pattern can be implemented, which is by two way. One is the event and delegates, and the second one is event aggregator. So this first one is event and delegates, where we'll be creating this message what we needs to pass from a publisher to subscriber. Then we create a instance of publisher which will be responsible for sending the data or publishing the data, where if you can see on screen that it has published data, and it has on data publisher it has been specified there that passing the arguments and whichever actions. This is a publisher, and will have subscriber which will be subscribing to this publisher. So if we see that in a real world, yeah, I have created this publisher service which will be actually responsible for publishing those things, messages, and I have created this subscriber methods where I am using this publisher as a delegate object in subscriber, and I am delegating the event that delegate objects event that item publisher should call this publisher item publisher event of this object. So that's how I'm specifying here. And for this for this tenant one, I'm subscriber one, I have specified here that item publisher one should get executed when the publisher sends performs the send publish message operations, which you can find here. So when this action get called, the delegated event which we have specified there, that should be created, and we should have this message arguments. So that's how we achieve the publish subscriber pattern in a normal way using event and delegate. If you run this, so this cd server 1, and this is a message which we are passing, and this executed at cd server 1, this executed at cd server 2. So this is one example of achieving that publish subscriber pattern using events and delegates, and the second one is using event aggregator, where uh, there are some issues with that event and delegate method, where there is a lot of coupling between publisher and subscriber, while subscriber needs to have that delegate object, and then needs to delegate the events. And then if you there are different kind of publisher and different kind of subscriber, then you need to create those kind of publishers. So those are some limitations of that, and which is liable for small application, but for larger application like Sitecore, which get used at an enterprise level, event aggregator is the solution, where event aggregator is the hub kind of thing, where it will be managing the subscribers and publishing the message, and so everything will be handled through this event aggregator. So in event aggregator, this subscription class, and this is how event aggregator looks like in a normal way, not about the Sitecore one. So in that one, there is a subscribe method, where all the subscriber which want to subscribe to that message, they subscribe using this method, which have the type, which kind of type they want to subscribe, and which action will be performed. So this majority ties to the type of action and which action they need to perform. So in our example, we created that event arguments, which is local event args. So that's a type, and we specified that handlers on local event method should got called. So that's an action. So that's a combination. That's how Sitecore identifies that if local event asks type of item I'm getting, then need to execute this method. So this is how Sitecore, this feature has been built in Sitecore using this design pattern. And now we'll be talking about the event queue. So event queue is a system table where the Sitecore stores all the information about the events, and that's how the remote events gets to know that event has been triggered. So for event queue to work, you there are few things you need to check first. First thing is that enable event queue should be true in your machine, and that's why. And then Sidecar will store all the information into that event queue. And so basically, when we talk about the remote event, where once the execution action has been performed on local event, we need to notify the remote events. So we adds that event to queue, that goes to queue uh, where all the remote servers are keeping watching on on the event queue table. So generally, which using remote event which we queue using event manager, that goes to core database. So if we go to database, then we can see that let me show you the event queue table in core database. This is how that gets stored in event queue database. That this is the type, instance type, and this is the data which we passed, which is item name and SUGNCR, and it is of type this type. So this data will get deserialized into this type when that action or events or handlers will get executed. This is instance name, that which instance has triggered this action. So which we triggered this action local event from CD environment. So this gets instance name as CD. So by default, if you haven't provided instance name in your setting in your Sitecore config, then it will take machine name hyphen your whatever the IIS site name is specified. So in this case, it is HC82 CD, and raised locally and globally is one. So this is about local how it stores in a event queue database. So generally, all the database like master, web, and core do have these event queues, and based on Sitecore's functionality, like which if it is only required for CM or master database, then those will be stored in master database event queue. But the event queue which will custom creating and will be queuing that for remote events, that will always go into core database, because that's have been mentioned specified there in the settings. So that will always go into core database. So one of the Sitecore MVP and cognified technology lead, John Rappel, has written a blog post on event queue, where he has clarified few of the things, that how misassumptions were there related to event queue and remote events. So we needs to look at that. So remote, we seen that how we create a local event, where we used to create event arguments, then creating event and event handlers configuration, and calling or raising the events. While let's see the steps for creating a remote event. So first step will be creating for a remote event is a custom event, which we followed in a local event. So all those steps which we followed in local event, that's needs to be followed for the remote events too. And the additional steps will be that they're adding an event to queue from your local machine, which is getting executed. So instead of raising the event, we'll be just adding that event to queue from your local event, local machine, and from all the remote events which needs to be executed, that events that needs to be subscribed to the remote events. So that's a third point. So in comparison to local event, these two steps are additional. One is adding event to queue instead of raising the event, and the third is subscribing to remote events, where all your remote servers needs to be subscribed to that event to execute that. So these are the additional steps. Let's see that how it should work in real time. Let close all related to local events. The same way as we said that custom, we need to create a custom event in a similar fashion how we created a local event. So the first step will be creating event arguments. That's remote event arguments. Created the same thing, same class, just a different type, so that we can have a separation there, because Sitecore will identify that based on type and the action. So this remote event args and item name which I have created. Then I have created this remote event handler. You just not need to look at this one for now. Just focus on this one. So this is the same way we created for local event. On local event, instead of this, we have this on remote event, and we are getting this argument. We are converting that to remote event arguments and adding a log entry, and which we are used to do in local event. And along with that, we are just adding one step, which is creating a creating an item in Sitecore, which is based on that sample item template. So this is one additional step we are performing in this remote event. So basically, consider a use case where you are on your production or on your CD public facing side, from where you want to create some items in Sitecore, where your public facing side will not have the connection string for master, and you could not directly create the items in master. Other options are that your master or your CM server should expose uh, some REST API, or you can use item API. But for that also your CM needs to be open for your public sites, which is not ideal situation. In that case, like you can create a remote event, so that you from the CD environment on your public facing site, you will be just queuing that remote event and passing the arguments from there. And based on that, that remote events gets executed on the on your CMs. It will create those items and publish those one. That's how you persist the items. So that's a ideal solution. So that's example I have created. That's why we have two CM and one CD in our setup for this demo. So I'll be creating this item from CD. Will be executing this, and this item needs to be created in master in using the CM machines, using remote events. So I've created this remote event, that what needs to be happen in when these remote events get executed. So this when these remote events get executed, we'll be adding a log entry, and we'll be creating a uh, item inside core in a master database. That's what needs to be happen. The same way we created a local event. So these two has been created. Now we'll look into specifying the this remote event, where in the similar way that events we specified local event, that event name, where we'll for remote we'll be specifying colon remote to identify that it is a remote event, and a handler which needs to be executed. This is remote event handler and remote event handler, and on remote event which we have specified here. So when these event, which is item local event remote, gets executed, this handler should get called. That's we have specified as we specified for the local event. These are the same steps you need to follow. Now now the two parts which are different from local event that comes into the picture. That once you have once you execute the action from your cd and your two cms wants to execute these remote events, then those two cms needs to be subscribed to this type. So for that, this is one additional configuration that in the Sitecore pipeline initialized pipeline, we have added this processor which calls Sitecore events remote event initialization. If you go to remote event initialization, what it does is it is subscribing using sitecore.events.event manager.subscribe. This is type, that remote event args is the type, and this is action. So it's basically saying that if this kind of type I found in event queue for me for this server, then this action needs to be executed. So it's subscribing based works based on this type and action. So based on this type, this action will get executed. So this type, when they find this type, the below raise remote event will get executed, where we are actually raising the event. It's the same way we have been raising the local event, where sitecore.events.event.raise event. So that's how we this will get this will raise the event on your remote machine. So what's the difference between local events and remote events in the calling perspective is that local event you are just calling this raise event, which which raises the event locally. You do not in the remote event. What you will be doing is that you will be creating arguments which you want to pass. I have created remote event arguments and specified SUGNCR as item name. And instead of raising the event, what I'll be doing is event manager.queue event. I'll be adding this event to queue, which is a type of remote arguments, and I specified the arguments which I want to pass. And your remote machines have already initialized that using this initialization, where they have specified remote arguments, and we are adding where we are adding this event to queue, and we have specified that argument. So based on this mapping will happen, and that this raise remote action will call when server will find this type of item in event queue. So creating a remote event has three steps. One is the how you create the local events. Same way you need to create that, which is arguments and your events and lures, all the configurations. Then second step will be to have that subscribe all your remote servers, not the server which is executing this event or which is adding this event to queue, not that one, but all the rest your server which are CM1 and CM2 in our case, that needs to have this initialization code, and that's how they subscribe to this type. And based on that, if the type is there in event queue, that methods will get executed, which is actually calling the local events. That's how the remote event works. Let's see the example and then we'll get back to this one again. Let's execute the remote event page, which again will call this one, where we created arguments and instead of raising the event, we have just added this to queue. So if we see in database that we should have that entry here. This is remote event entry, and this instance has added this entry. And if you look, we have these two parameters when it is raised locally and raised globally. So it means that raised locally is false right now. So this instance which has added this entry into the queue does not needs to execute this event. And that's how we can identify that from cd we have just added that into queue, but that action does not need to be performed on cd. That actually needs to be performed on cm1 and cm2. So that's why we have said this raise globally one. So the scheduler which which uh, which triggers every 2 seconds. If you see here, this scheduler triggers every 2 seconds on each server, be it CD, CM1, CM2. So once I added that event to queue from CD, all the CM1 and CM2 will be polling to that event queue table, and they will see this entry is there, and its type is remote event args. Then they will check that whether we have subscribed to that one using this subscription code, event initialization code. Do we have subscribed to that? If yes, then they will see that is raise global is true, and it's not our instance name. This is not, this is CD, and I am CM1 and raise global is one. So I need to execute the action which is specified along with the type, which is this action I need to specify, and these arguments will be passing from here. That's how that remote events works. Now we have executed this one. Let's see, it should have created two items under home. Now this is interesting. Like we have CM1 and CM2, and we have CD. We have requirement that from CD, when such action perform, we need to create an item on CM, and that needs to be published to CD. But we do not want that duplicate items one should be created. There should be only one item created, which is SUGNCR, but we are now seeing two items. That is because we have published this code in CM1 and CM2 and CD3, all of three, and initialization and all code is present in all three environment on three instance. But the CD is not creating item because it is adding that event to queue itself, and raise locally is not true, and raise global is true, but instant name is the same, so it will not execute that event. But the rest of one, which is CM1 and CM2, will execute that, and it will create two items, which is not an ideal in my case. So what I'll be doing is, this initialization code should only be present on your remote machines, which is CM1 and CM2, where you want this action to be performed. So if you want that only one CM should perform this action and not the second CM, then you can remove this from the second CM. Let's go back to CM2, and we'll be just disabling that config. If you don't want to disable and just want, if you just remove this initialization code, then that should be fine, because it will not anyway call it will not anyway call this event, so that's fine. But for now we have all this in single configuration file. We'll be just disabling that. Now once our CM2 is up, we'll be again processing, again do the same step. For now I'll be just deleting these items. So the CM2 is up now, and where we have removed that initialization part. So once the CD server, when we perform this action on a CD, it should add event to the queue, and only the CM server should be able to create that item, not the CM2, because we have disabled that initialization part on CM2. So let's just execute this remote event on CD. Now, this all are sharing the same database so we can check anywhere we want. So it only created one item, which is an ideal way. So that's how remote events works. It's quite simple, but you need to make sure the few things that where which server needs to have that initialization plan. Does if we see the different scenario that, for example, your CM is creating an item or changing an item and publishing that, then if you have multiple CD1, CD2, CD3, probably all CD should have that event subscribe so that they can clear the cache and all those things. But if you have the scenario like this where from CD you are creating item on CM, then if you have multiple CM, then not more than one item should created, then only one CM should have that initialization part present, while you can skip that on a CM2 where you don't want to create that item. So that's how you need to be mindful when you create a remote events. Now we seen that local events and remote events how that works. Now let's see some myth might have about the remote events. So these are the things needs to be keep in mind for remote events. That first one is that local events required to set up a remote event, which is no. You don't need a custom perform event to set up the custom perform remote event. It is totally optional as per the business needs. So if we look at a remote event controller part where we are just adding this to queue, we are not any calling any local event like items colon local event. We are not calling that. We are just adding this to queue, which is a remote event. So it does not require that there needs to be a you need to raise a local event and then you can add your remote event into queue. So that is not required. But in most of the case we find that together because something needs to happen on local. That's why we raise that local event, and something needs to happen on remote events. That's why we add this into queue. So those both we see a lot of together, but it is not required. The second thing is only subscribe to the server you really want to execute the remote events, which we seen like your CM1 and CM2, uh, both are there, and but you want that to be executed only once on a single machine. Then from the second machine you need to remove this initialization part, which is specified in initialization pipeline. So you need to remove that one. So only subscribe to the server you really want to execute the remote events. The third one is that little complicated, that remote event is a local event for a remote server. Little bit of confusing, like that what you are trying to say, that remote event is local event. What is local event? If we are seeing the differences between local event and remote event, so the remote event is nothing just like a local event, uh, but how that needs to be triggered is just a different than a local event. In local event on a single server we are just raising that raise event. Using that raise event we are raising that event, and that's how it is different in remote event. Other than that, all the parts are arguments and specifying the events and all those are same. So if we see in, so we specified this event and this event handler, which is similar to the local event. So there isn't any difference between local events and remote event when we specify this for remote server. This is the same, only that to execute that remote event in on a remote servers, your local machine where that action is getting executed, you are adding that to queue, and on your remote server this additional part should be present, which will know that for this type I need to execute this action, and in that action, very action which is initialized, we have specified that this action needs to be executed. So when this execute action will be executed, we are again doing the same thing which we used to do in a local event, which is raising an event using event name. So specifying it as remote in event name doesn't become a remote. So from this step, this remote event will become a local event for this remote server. And do not use raised locally only for the debugging purpose. So if you have only a one single development environment where you don't have CMCD separate, and you are adding that to queue, and you don't have this raised locally specified, that is false. And in that case, that event will not get executed because raised locally is false. Raised locally is false, so that will not get executed. And if you specify here one, then that will also get executed on your CD environment, but that is not ideal. Like if you forgot to remove this raise locally true, and if that got promoted to distributed environment, then that will behave abnormal. So that's all for now on parts of events, which we covered: local events and remote events. These are some of the reference which I have taken. Uh, one is design pattern, which we saw publish and subscriber pattern. For design pattern, if you want to look at in detail for some of the design patterns, then my colleague Nishis has written shared slide, took on a presentation which is he has uploaded in SlideShare, and also provided a GitHub path so that you can download and play there. For events, this is the best link which I have specified in must read, which uh, which which talks all about the events and local events and global events. This has all the information, though it is little bit old, so you might require to change something if you follow all this one, but this is a great start point. And this is example where it is showing some event action methods. Then event queue, as I mentioned, that John Rappel has created this blog post, written this blog post which talks about in detail about the event queue and how remote event works. So you all should go to this blog and read out that without fail, because that will give you a detailed idea about that how remote event works and how event queue works. And this is a nice short video there, and it explains the same scenarios which we covered. So one thing which we didn't didn't cover is that how your CM, how your remote servers will get to know that I need to execute this, and do not once I have executed this, I do not need to execute this again. So for that, there is a property table where once this event is get executed, it will store that stamp into this property, and the next time when that it will be polling to that event queue table, it will it will do first comparison between these properties, where that server's key will be there, which is a queue stamp and the instance name, and it will see that if the timestamps for the current event is greater than what is there in property, only then that needs to be executed. This is all nicely presented here, so I encourage you to go there and look at once. And for custom remote events, these are some of the blogs where you can find your starting point. Although you will find little bit of difficulty if you really want to set up some remote events, but I tried to simplify that using how you can create a local event, how you can create a remote events, how you add that to queue, and how the initialization, which is subscription part, that should be done. That's how uh, I have done that. And yeah, thank you. That's what's up about Sitecore events. Short and simple. If you have any questions.
Thanks, Pratik, for the session. I especially learned a lot about the remote events. So, guys, if you have any questions, you can drop it on the chat window. We can wait for 2 or 3 minutes to have some questions. So, Pratik, we got a question from Sam Alam. So, in one of the slides, you were mentioned that if we want to enable the event queue, then we need to like set the configuration as true or false in the sitecore.config file. So
Yep.
what if we'll set the configuration as false? Then the remote events will work or not? I mean, what will happen if we set it to the false?
Yep. So let's just see that setting, what it says.
Yeah.
If we read that, if enable Sitecore sends local events to the event queue available to remote instances and handles events in the queue from local instances. So if this is false in your CD environment from where you are adding that to queue, it will not get added to the queue, and that's why your CM1 and CM2, which are waiting for that event, that will not see any event in event queue. So this will not work.
Okay. Okay. So I hope Sam, this answers your question. So we are waiting for like few minutes, and let's see if we have any questions. Then I'll let you know.
Sure.
So I guess, Pratik, you can like conclude the session, and we don't have any questions yet.
All right. So I'll be adding all this exercise to GitHub, and will provide you the link so you can drop that link to this video, and I will also share that via social media. So if anyone wants to clone that and see how local events, the remote event has been built, they can do. So again, thanks for this arranging this session, Nitish. Thanks a lot, and all attendees. Thanks for attending this session. It means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to you, Pratik, and also thanks to all the participants for joining this session. So have a good day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.